Hello, and welcome to episode number 178 of the Board Game Barrage podcast. I am your host today, Kellen, the only red tank, joined as always by Mark and Neelan, the orange and green tank.
Hello.
Hello.
Board Game Barrage is a podcast about board games, the latest hotness, and how to have fun with your friends, even when you're losing. And today on the show, we are going to be talking about some of the games that we have been playing this past week. In addition, we're going to be talking about board game production and how board game production can help or hinder a game and what that means. Mark is going to start us off with The King is Dead 2E, and that 2E stands for second edition, if you aren't aware. I am going to be talking about our play of Equinox, and then Neelan is going to talk to us about a enchanting game of Enchanted Plumes, and those plumes belong to...
Peacocks.
I almost said ostriches. Those would not be as enchanting.
Known for their majestic plumage.
Is it plumage?
Yeah.
Yes.
Use that word in a sentence.
The majestic plumage of the peacock hypnotized me.
All right, Mark.
Your turn, Mark.
It's an easy lead-in. Tell us about The King is Dead 2E.
So the plumage of the peacock comes in a bunch of different colors. 3 of those colors, I think, could be red, yellow, and blue. And those are the 3 colors of the 3 factions that are in The King is Dead 2nd edition. Those 3 factions are the Scottish, the Welsh, and the English. I think Scottish are blue, Welsh are red, and English are yellow. I will offend people if that's incorrect, but I believe that is correct. Anyway.
And my ancestors are from, in part, Wales, so don't say anything.
Can you speak Welsh?
No.
I'm half English, so we've almost got the full King is Dead.
Oh, I'm 3/4 Scottish, so it's perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You look it.
I'm eating some haggis right now. Anyhow, The King is Dead 2nd edition is a redo of the previous edition, which is King is Dead, which itself was a redo of The King of Siam, which was an older game. So The King is Dead is a game of area control and hand management sort of to the nth degree. Your entire action set throughout a game of The King is Dead comes down to playing cards from your hand. And that hand starts with the full complement of 8 cards. You will never gain any more cards. And every time you use a card, it is gone for the rest of the game. So your entire game of The King is Dead is a maximum of 8 actions. The way this works is you have a map of Britain, and the map is populated with cubes, which are red, yellow, or blue, representing the 3 factions. You are going to start the game with a couple randomly assigned cubes as well. So you may have a yellow and blue, and that means you start with sort of a lean toward the Scottish and English in that case. And the board is made up of 8 territories. And those territories are also represented by 8 cards that are on the sides of the boards that are randomly dealt, and that will track the order of how these territories are going to be evaluated. So Warwick is one of the territories. It may be the first card played, and therefore Warwick is going to be the first territory that is going to be evaluated. And, you go down, and the last one may be Lancaster, or you may have dealt this with Lancaster's first. So there's a randomization in terms of the order in which the 8 territories are evaluated. And so on your turn, you have a choice of one of 2 things. You can either play a card, do the action on it, and then take a cube from anywhere on the board to your own supply, showing that you have more influence in that faction. So, I might play a card, do whatever it says on the card, and then take a red cube to my personal supply. That means that I have more influence in the red faction, which is the Welsh one in this case. So that's one thing you can do. And again, you're going to do that a maximum of 8 times throughout the entire game. Or you can pass. If all the players pass consecutively, that ends the round, and then the current territory is evaluated. But if you pass, you can come back in. So, sometimes you are sort of gambling that somebody else is going to take an action and it's going to come back to you to play again. And you're risking the fact that, if you pass and the next couple players pass, then the territory is going to be evaluated. The way the cards work are fairly simple. You have 3 cards that add a certain color to the board. So if I play the blue card of this type, you would add 2 blue cubes from the supply to any territory that you want, therefore strengthening the blue numbers in that territory. When a territory is evaluated, all you're doing is you're checking to see which color has the most cubes in that territory, and then that territory is considered like winning for that color. So for example, if a territory has 3 blue, 2 yellow, and 1 red, and that territory is evaluated. It is now blue territory. And at the end of the game, whichever territory has the most control over the board, whichever player has the most cubes of that color in their own personal supply wins. So if at the end of the game, red has the most control cubes on the board, and Nealon has 3 red cubes in front of him, and Kellen and I have 2 each, then Nealon wins the game. There's a twist, though, where if a territory is tied for first place, it's considered controlled by none of the 3 factions, and instead France has control. And if France ever gets control of 3 territories on the map, the game is instantly ended, and the winner becomes not who has the most of any particular color, but whoever has the most sets of color. So you want balance in that case. So that's basically how The King is Dead works. As an aside, the second edition has a variant that we did not play with, but for those who are interested, who have played the original version or considering getting this new version, first of all, I think it's a brighter, sort of more pretty production, speaking of production, but in addition, it includes this option of playing in a different way, which is the original version of King is Dead, everybody has the same 8 cards to start the game, so everybody has the exact same hand. In the variant, you take out 3 cards, everybody takes out 3 cards, and they're dealt 3 different cards that are all different, so you don't know what the 3 cards are in your opponent's hands, and they do different things. So they sort of allow for a level of blindness where you don't know what potential actions your opponents have. So I've played King's Dead First Edition before. I enjoyed it, but it didn't blow my socks off. It was just a game that I considered like a solid game. Not one that I even kept. I've since traded it. But when it came up as a game to potentially play at a game night, I was all for it. Somebody hadn't played it, and they wanted to give it a shot, so I was all for giving it another shot. And I enjoyed myself again. Again, it wasn't a mind-blowing experience, but I did enjoy it more this time. I did appreciate it more this time, just because of the sort of suffocating nature of it. You know, you start out with 8 cards, you know that this is all you have, and every time you play a card, if you feel like you didn't maximize the turn, you're left with like a lot of regret, because like, I only have 8 plays, was that card used properly or not? And then, you know, there's the other aspect where you just see your hand dwindling, and you know, you look across the table and you've got 2 cards, your opponent has 4 cards, they can do twice as much as you can do on the board, and there's the idea of like, wait, did they use their double blue card or not? So there's a sort of a little bit of a memory aspect to it. But the main overwhelming thing is just the fact that like, we're all on the same playing field. We all start on the same level. And it's just like a winnowing down. Like, am I going to play all my cards early, try to make a big push and hold on? Or am I going to sit back, potentially lose some big fights early with the hope that keeping a reserve is going to benefit me in the end? I really enjoyed it. It's a short game. It feels like a very classic game. You know, there's very little iconography on it. And it has a lot of sort of like that sort of abstract chess-like things to it where it's very strategic. And, you know, there's a tactical side too, but all of that in a game where you're only playing 8 cards. I know that this game turns off a lot of people, and I totally understand why, but it feels like a great bite of like agony, for lack of a better term, and I'm sure I could have come up with a better term than bite of agony, but yeah, I really enjoy it. There's a lot there for a small package and, you know, small hand of cards.
I think I'm also like impressed by the fact that this is listed as a 30 to 45 minute game. Like, is it that fast?
Yes,
Might even be faster than that, honestly.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, the thing that will slow the game down is absolutely analysis paralysis because of that pressure. But the game itself can certainly be played quickly. This would be a game that would, I think, benefit from a chess clock for sure.
My experience with The King is Dead comes from The King is Dead, I believe, so not the original Siam, but I think the last version. This game always has so many fervent supporters that I have just that small bit of like, what do they see that I don't? Kind of like when you get out of an art film and you're like, what? Why is everyone crying right now? I didn't get it. You know, my plays of this, it sort of felt like everyone tried to not tip their hand, and then the last few turns determine who wins. It has a little bit of a feeling of like Pax Pamir in the way the factions sort of suss out, and I don't know that I could even describe it in that I haven't played it in a few years. But then my experience was that it was always about like the second or third or fourth tiebreaker that actually decided who wins the game, which is just mildly unsatisfying to me. But in terms of like much loved area control games, this has just been getting all of the love over the past year from sort of every review outlet that I respect and admire.
So that is The King's Dead 2nd Edition by Osprey Games.
I remember buying it, and I remember having it in my closet, and I remember getting rid of it.
2nd Edition?
No.
Oh,
1E. 1E. not 2Es for me. Speaking of games that have come back, we have a game to talk about from the only true and living Dr. Reiner Knizia. Reiner Knizia released an old game, Colossal Arena. Well, I guess it wasn't old when he released it in 1997, and it is brought back in 2021 by Plan B Games as Equinox, which confused me at first because there is an Asmodee Games game called Equinox from a few years back that I also enjoy as a weird lark. But this Equinox, well, actually, I don't even know that we got into the theme, but essentially Equinox Colossal Arena is a Reiner Knizia game that feels pretty different from other Reiner Knizia games. You are going through a series of 5 rounds where all the woodland creatures face off against each other in some form of battle. In Colossal Arena, they were in the arena and someone would die. A round of Equinox will go until every creature has a card played in its column, and one creature is clearly losing the battle. So if any creatures are tied for last place, the battle will continue until every creature has a card and there is a weakest creature, and then that creature will die. And then you move on to round 2, where all of the 7 creatures who are left will continue to compete until someone else dies. And then you move on. So slowly, we're whittling away the forest creatures. And you may ask, well, why do I care about which creatures live or die in the Equinox Forest? Well, that's a great question. And the answer is that over the course of the game, you get 5 total bets. And the earlier you bet on a creature, the more victory points you get. Or in this game, I believe they are PP, which is my least favorite reduction of the word victory points, PP. At the start of the game, everyone is able to take a secret bet and take a card from their hand and play it face down, and then they have stakes in the game, and every bet after that is public. So if you bet in the first round, that's going to be worth the most victory points. So betting early is how you score the most, but it also puts a target on your back. And let me tell you, when I bet on Hoot Hoot, Mark wants to kill it.
That's right.
You know? And of course, I went for the cute things, and Mark was like, I'm a brochado. I need my Firefox. Like, that's what I care about. So the game has that fun feeling of you are allowed to play cards to any of these columns, any of these creatures. And so, you know, even if you've not bet and Mark has bet on a creature, you can play the 0 card of that creature and really just annoy him. And so, you know, sort of, oh, the battle looks like it's going well. Well, now it's not going so well, Mark, because Firefox has a big fat 0. And that is hysterical and funny and fun. Each creature has a range of cards in the deck from, I believe, 0 to 10. So that is the basis of Equinox or Colossal Arena. You whittle it down through 5 rounds. I believe 3 creatures survive. Everyone scores victory points based on how early they made bets. Literally all of your victory points are just built off of those 5 bets. So losing an early bet and that creature dying is painful in Equinox, right? But each creature in Equinox has special powers, and those special powers can only be activated by the controller. So the concept of being the controller in Equinox has to do with, it's a little more convoluted than I like from Reiner Knizia. The concept of control is you have to have made the biggest total bets on a creature, and then on a subsequent turn, when you play a creature card of that type, you are the controller. So not only do you play that card, but you also get to use its special power. Its special power may be to allow you to steal cards from other players' hands, force players to play with only half of their hand for a subsequent round, pick up a card from a previous battle that you can keep going forward. There is also chameleon cards, which are sort of wilds, and there's creatures that can affect the chameleon cards. That, in a nutshell, is how Colossal Arena and Equinox works. My version of Colossal Arena was a small box card game previously, and this newer version is quite a lavish production. We've got tarot-sized cards, really beautiful artwork that has like a unique style, and stones for your bets that are quite beautiful as well, in addition to bags for the stones that I don't understand why you would ever need or use the bag. This game also comes with 2 different covers, one with a stag on the front and one with what looks to be a giant. That is the overview of Equinox. What did you guys think of Equinox / Colossal Arena?
I liked it a fair bit, so I think I'm the only one of the three of us that has not had prior experience with Colossal Arena, so I was coming into this fresh. And I think that there's something so fun about the core concept, which, let's call the theme of the game, because it's what it is, really, which is like the idea that you have some emotional stakes in these animals and they're fighting each other, then one of them dies. Like, I think is great. Like, the idea that you start with 8 and then every round one of them dies and you're left with the 3 winning ones, I think is a cool concept. Like, just the idea of putting your stakes in one of them and then trying your best to keep them alive until the end. I think that really worked for me as a theme, because then when, like me, you do the dumb thing of going all in on the Great Stag and making sure as hell that you're going to try to keep him alive, and then Mark swoops in and without any thought for the Great Stag decides to kill it unjustly, that hurts. Yeah. It really hurt, Mark.
So fun. The play order was Neil, Kellen, me, and a round ends when every animal has been assigned a number, and one animal has the lowest number by itself. And Kellen was playing before me, and I'm like, I just see that Nealon has 2 bets on the stag, and I'm like, if I can kill that stag, I don't care what happens in the game. If I can kill a stag, I'll be thrilled. And then Kellen puts out a card, leaving the stag being the only animal without a card, and I have a 1 stag card I've been holding on just for this moment. I could not wait for Kellen to put down his card and sit back in his seat, and the moment he pulled his hand away, that stag was dead.
Yeah.
It was over for the stag.
And that was a very sort of wake up moment for me in the game, because it was the one thing I hadn't quite internalized, was how quickly that tempo can turn against you. It's like, oh wait, no, this is not going to get back to me. I'm not going to have time to protect that stag with the 9 I'm holding in my hand, because Mark's going to kill it before me. And I think that watching the card row thin out, and especially because it gets faster and faster as each round progresses, because more and more animals are dying, keeping your mind on the way the tempo is progressing feels like a big part of the game is. But it's also just light and fluffy enough where, Mark's killing my stag because I tried to kill his goat man in the previous round, and that's fun.
Yeah.
I think sometimes in a game like this, you'd be really annoyed at the cards that you draw. But something that I like about Equinox is that, if I draw a 5 of Goatman, and that's Mark's animal, and I don't care, I really wanted 10s of my animals, but a 5 of Goatman can situationally work out really well, because randomly it'll get to me, and there's a bunch of played cards, and the only one left is Goatman, and a 5 is actually going to make it the weakest. And so it feels really fun to have a range of cards that are both weak and strong in a variety of animals, because you figure out what you got to do with them. I do think that Colossal Arena and Equinox have a weird tempo problem. And I don't know that I'm using the word tempo in the way that we traditionally use the word tempo, but that is that the bets that you make at the beginning of the game are by far the most important part. And as the game progresses, keeping your animal alive is important, but the bets you make, literally the bets you make in the last round are worth 0 points, which I still am trying to grapple with what that means. But the bets that you make in the 4th round are worth 1 point compared to the secret bets being worth 5 points. And so there's this weird idea where the beginning betting matters and then it doesn't matter at all. And then all you're trying to do is desperately keep animals alive. But by the same token, it's very fun. It's very interesting. And it doesn't feel like any other Reiner Knizia game to me for someone who iterates on themselves so often.
It feels a lot like Colossal Arena.
Okay. Yeah, I think the difference is here there are more animals, if I'm not mistaken. So there are 14 in the box, and you only use 8 in each game. I think that we would be betraying our topic, if we strayed too far into the production conversation here. But there are some very confusing production decisions in Equinox.
Correct. Yes. My copy of Colossal Arena, and you've already mentioned this, sort of, Kellen, is a extremely small package. It's basically a little over the size of, I would say, 3 decks of cards. Just enough room for the cards and some. Actually, the last Colossal Arena version by Fantasy Flight has these pretty nice, sort of metallic looking beads you use for betting. But all of that, again, in the size of a package that is about 3 decks of cards big. And this is, as you mentioned, you've got tarot sized cards, and you've got these really large, I don't know, they're sort of clay looking betting chips. I mean, it's very nice looking, but whereas you could play Colossal Arena on any table, when it comes to Equinox, it's sort of like quite a table hog for as slim as it could be.
Yeah, imagine tarot cards, right? And you've got 8 columns of monsters, and then you've got 5 rounds, and then the cards that denote those rounds. And so it literally took up almost our entire table, which is insane for what the game actually is. Mm-hmm. So just a baffling decision there to make those tarot-sized cards. I mean, the art is cool.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
It's very pretty. Like, the production aesthetic is, I think, pretty solid, actually.
Yeah. And then, the other combination there, right, is that all of the powers of the animals are symbols as opposed to written. And, these are tarot-sized cards, so you could fit certainly a lot of text on them. And having to remember what each of the powers does in a game where the powers actually don't go off as often as you would like means you are more often than not going back to the back of the rule book to figure out what they do instead of consulting the card game that takes up your entire table.
That's a good point. And actually, probably mechanically, my biggest criticism of the game was exactly that. I kind of felt like my reaction afterwards of the power system, despite this obviously being a redesign of an old game, I just felt like that power system felt still like undercooked to me. Like, it's like you have all these unique powers, but they just don't go off as often because you have to both be invested in the animal and then have a corresponding card and want to play it to that column in order to trigger the power. So it just felt like I wish there was more ways to trigger them.
I sort of like the fact that it's sort of a rare thing because I just think it'd be a little too chaotic if it was firing off all the time. I don't know.
They also just didn't seem powerful enough, though. So even when you did trigger them, a lot of the times it was like, okay, I'll do this thing. But that, I don't know, like
Sure.
The combination of them both feeling like perhaps not as strong as they could be and not going off enough just kind of made you feel, okay, I wish there was more to this.
That is Equinox by Plan B Games. And the description on BGG is bid on legendary creatures, then help them survive to become legends. I have a feeling that they have tried to take out the murder your animals motif, but I am not willing to read the flavor text in the rulebook to find out.
So we all played a game of Enchanted Plumes by Calliope Games and the designer Brendan Hansen. This was sent to us as a review copy. This is a very light card game that was a Kickstarter that Calliope Games ran that is completed and is now shipping out to people. It is a light card game where what you are trying to do is assemble the plumage of a peacock. The cards are all feather cards of 10 different colors, numbered from 0 to 9. So in total, there are 100 cards. You're going to remove some of those depending on player count, but that's it. You have a full set of every color. You'll start the game with 6 of those, and on your turn, you're going to play up to 2 of them, and then recover cards into your hand by either drawing them blind from the top of a deck or taking them from an array that is shared and accessible by everyone. But when you take a card from the array, you must discard a card to the array as well. So you either swap to the array or draw blindly from the deck until you're back up to 6 cards. And that's your turn. What you're trying to do with these feather cards is assemble them into these, sort of think of them as sort of triangles, like fans of cards. What I mean by that is you start by creating the top row of the feathers, and you can make these as small or as long as you want. So let's say I wanted to make the top row ultimately 4 cards. So I would play 2, then on a subsequent turn I'd play the next 2, and now I have a top row of 4 cards. On any subsequent turn when I play, if I wanted to start the second row of that, I will then start to place the cards so they're overlapping the 2 cards above. So they're sort of triangling down into like a fan. You keep doing this until you've reached theoretically the bottom card, which you would play face down to complete your peacock. And that's kind of what you're aiming to do. The twist to this, though, is once you've established your top row of cards, once you've decided this is how big my top row is, and once you start your second row, that top row is locked. You can no longer expand the top row, and that is now the only colors that are allowed to be in your peacock tail. So let's say I made the top row a red, a green, and a blue card, and then I start my second row. I'm now establishing that this peacock is 3 cards, then 2 cards, then 1 card, and will only contain red, green, and blue feathers. And that includes the bottom card that you place face down. The second twist of this is that top row of cards, all those cards are negative points, and only the cards below that are going to score positively. So there's this balance of trying to want to collect low cards in order to make a very big top row, and also collect big cards so that once you've established your top row, you can start to build your high scoring cards of the correct colors to assemble your peacock. In addition, every peacock you complete all the way is going to give you bonus points just based on how big that peacock is. Even if your peacocks are incomplete, they're still going to score the points based on the card values, but you only get the bonus points if you complete it all the way to the bottom. You're going to keep doing this until a peahen card shows up, which is buried somewhere near the bottom of the deck, and as soon as that shows up, the game's instantly over and everyone scores. And that's basically the gist of the game. I thought that this was a very pleasant, light card game that I feel like I got some pushback on this, but it reminded me a little bit of Arboretum, which is to say that part of the trade-off of the game is what colors are other people using. If I see Mark is using a lot of red and Christine is using a lot of red, I probably don't want to start building a red peacock because I know that those cards are in short supply. In addition, if you want to take a nice card that you see in the array, that decision of what card am I giving up to get it is vital, because Mark started to build his blue peacock. I don't want to give him a blue 9. That's like giving Mark 9 points. So that consideration of what you're throwing away to get a card is vital. That said, it's certainly not like as mean as Arboretum. It's a very, very light, very breezy game that plays up to 6 players, and I think would go smoothly at any player count. I like this a fair bit. What did you guys think of Enchanted Plumes?
I also enjoyed it. It's a game where I enjoyed it after we played it, but I found myself over the course of the last 24 hours like thinking about it and wanting to play it again, partially because it does scratch that itch that I have about, like, you know, hand management games where decisions are tough. I will say I get the Arboretum thing. I just feel like it's a defanged Arboretum, and therefore like loses a lot, because one of the best things about Arboretum is how tough it is. And so the fact that this is not as tough means it's like, for me, sure, there's some like overlap between it and Arboretum, but it's like so, again, defanged and not as agonizing that the comparison might as well not be there. But I get what you're saying. It's a game where I think the rule set is slight enough that it can sort of get out of the way. And, you know, that first game for us, it was trying to figure out how things were going and what the drawing of cards and exchanging of cards even meant in terms of like the flow and like the timing of things. But I think halfway through that game, certainly toward the end of the game, I think we all sort of internalized things. And I just think because the rule set is as slight as it is, you'll be able to explore the game and like jump right into it and just sort of take advantage of it way more on subsequent plays than that first play that may be a little stuttering. So I'm very excited to give it another shot.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Mark, is that it can feel very loose until it's not. You know what I mean? Like, it just feels like nothing matters that I'm doing, but then you're like, oh crap, now it really matters, and everyone's really desperately paying attention to the colors. The sort of negatively invest to positively invest reminded me of Lost Cities, where you have to decide whether you're going to go into something. And so, you know, I really want to be able to play, 4 cards in the next row, so I have to play 5 cards into the negative row, and how many negative points am I willing to put in that row to keep going down? The game really impressed me from the perspective of just feeling unlike any other small set collecting, like the mechanics of what you're doing of building these plumes. I was just like, is this just a normal set collecting game being presented to me in a different way, and I somehow can't trace it back to what it actually is? And I find that quite delightful from the perspective of just seeing something that I don't think I've seen anywhere else, which is that, it can only be made up of the colors of the row above it. And so as you whittle down, even in the third to last row, it's like, okay, I'm putting down 3 cards. I really don't want them to all be the same color, because then the next row is going to get even harder. It's going to get even more punishing. So I want to split that if I can. I had a really great time with this. This plays 2 to 6 players. I'm eager to see how it goes at that higher player count. I imagine it's probably a little bit too silly at that player count. I will say, getting ahead of ourselves again to the production, what's our production episode that we are making right now, I have been having some eye problems, one could say. And this game with 10 colors was a huge challenge to my color blindness. And I've actually, in the past week, been officially diagnosed with some of that color blindness. And it was actually a bit worse than I expected, according to my neuro-ophthalmologist. So for anyone keeping score, that's a few levels above optometrist. But the game does attempt to use different symbols in the feather cards to differentiate, but any game with 10 color suits is going to have a hard time. And I think they combined with a very stark white card. And in my mind, they could have gone farther and used some color on the border of the card or some way to help differentiate. But I was really struggling with some of the yellows and the whites and the reds and the purples to the point that it made it difficult as I was looking around the table to try to figure out what to discard or what to not invest in. With that said, I do think it's fair to say that anything with 10 color suits, I don't know that I've ever played a game that has that many different colors of suits in such a simple card game.
Yeah, I think that part of this, I don't want to say easily because accessibility is like a complicated problem, but like there could be some like patterning to the back that could be a little bit more stark that would help this out. You know, like Arboretum gets away with it with like the silhouettes of the trees being different from each other. And I feel like the feathers on their whole just felt quite similar. So only the color really separates them. And that's a hard thing to try solve with color alone. But yeah, I think color production issues aside, I would say that this was an otherwise pleasant game that I think we all enjoyed more than we were expecting. Is that fair to say?
Yeah.
That is Enchanted Plumes by Calliope Games.
The two things that we will say here in the middle, one is I'm always convinced that the way to solve color blindness is to add more light to my living room, and I keep adding more and more lamps and it doesn't work. So if anyone has a suggestion on the best lighting solution for board games, I would actually be interested to hear, and you can find me on Discord or you can email us at boardgamebarrage@gmail.com. I'm curious what you use to have the perfect lighting for board games.
While I'm thinking about it, Kellen, like I don't know that this scientifically, but I think like white light versus yellow light might be something you want to look into.
Well, and I do goof with the temperatures. It's just like as we're sitting there, I'm always like, it has to be wrong right now. I don't know. And then the other call out we will do here, we are looking to redo the Board Game Barrage homepage. So if you are a web developer, web designer, it should be a simple job because it's just the main homepage, but we need to make it lightning fast. And we have money we're willing to pay. So please reach out to us at boardgamebarrage@gmail.com if you would be able to help out with redoing our homepage. Thank you, everyone who has participated so far in the draft. We will be covering the results of that draft in next week's episode. We wanted to give it at least a full week for people to enter into the contest, and because we record these a few days in advance, it did not feel fair, but we will be announcing the winner of Mark, Neelan, and myself, as well as giving away that $50 gift card to a board game retailer of your choice. We hear you. More drafts are coming. We'll definitely be doing some more voting and some more prizes and giveaways because it's been a really fun episode and reception to last week's episode.
And as a reminder, the last chance to vote on that draft episode is ending soon. So go to boardgamebarrage.com/draft if you want to do that. Again, boardgamebarrage.com/draft.
Great. So let's just steamroll right into today's feature topic. I think we've already sort of spilled the goose, the peacock, the ostrich.
Yeah,
That's what they say.
Peacock.
We wanted to talk about production and how it relates to board game design. I think that for many, it's hard to separate. I think it's sort of a next level thing. I relate it in some ways to how I think about movies. And when I first started to watch movies more critically, someone would be like, oh, I didn't like the direction in this movie. And I'm like, what the are you talking about? Like, what does that even mean? And so I think separating in board games, separating the production from the game design itself is kind of this interesting idea. And so we wanted to talk about how games are strengthened and weakened by their production with some specific examples. I think we've already started with some specific examples of how Equinox could be improved through its production and how color blindness can affect things. But in general, Mark, why don't you tell us how board games are strengthened and weakened by their production?
Well, again, sort of talked about how they can be weakened. I think sometimes production can sort of get in the way of the actual gameplay. You know, there is a idea, you know, in the quote-unquote Kickstarter age where, you know, selling a game based on the number of miniatures and the way the customized dice and the number of pieces and all these things to sort of bling out the game. There's that race to be the best in that, be the best in sort of production. And sometimes I feel like the draw of that can supersede the need to make the game easy to play, easy to understand, you know, easy to comprehend. And I think a good example of this is Tang Dynasty, which is a game I didn't actually play, but Kellen, I remember in his review, was talking about how the game is so overproduced, has all these pieces to the extent where you couldn't even really read the board and read the iconography, and it sort of got in the way of the actual gameplay.
Yeah, I think there's an interesting example of this. Bunny Kingdom, in its original release, was actually on a smaller board. and it's a huge grid where a ton of bunnies are populating the board, and it made it so hard for people to like read or see what was happening that they actually went back and increased the size of the game board to allow for people to better see and evaluate the board state. And so, a lot of times we'll harp on something like iconography, which is a part of art design and ultimately part of the production. But the size of the board itself is a production decision. It was likely made to cut costs, but they just made it too small, and that impacted how people perceived and were able to even evaluate the game state in order to make decisions in the game.
And on the other hand, there are games, and we'll go into more detail later, where the production choices, while increasing like the appeal of the game, have also been made with a mind to make the game more accessible or more easy to understand, or just make the gameplay smoother. I know that in our pre-recording, Kellen brought up Smartphone Inc. and the design choices there. For example, I'm sort of speaking for Kellen here, so he can feel free to jump in, but there is the problem that you have in a lot of games, like El Grande, a game that was mentioned last week, where you have a reserved set of cubes and a active set of cubes, and you're not allowed to use the reserved set of cubes until you've sort of like activated them and made them like part of your personal supply. And sometimes remembering which pile is which, and that kind of stuff is confusing. Onset Tonica has the same sort of idea. With Smartphone Inc., they have sort of addressed that issue by having sort of a component tray that sort of segments the cubes into one set or the other. So that's just an example of a game where that component holder is really nice. It definitely is part of the sort of table appeal of the game, but also serves a very fundamental like functional purpose as well.
Yeah, I hate games that do that, where you have like a reserve supply and then like an inactive set of workers. I think there are games that do it better or worse. I think, for example, I recently played another game of A Study in Emerald, 2nd edition, where it sends away your cubes to limbo. And when they're in limbo, you just can't have them. So everything that's in front of you, you can have. And then when they're gone, they're gone. And again, that's kind of a production decision to have limbo be a place on the board, whereas there are games where you have your reserve and then you have your available supply, and those are both supposed to be in front of you, where for me, if it's in front of me, I want to use it.
Right.
Like, I want to be able to use it. I don't understand. And that actually becomes a barrier to me grasping what I'm capable of doing in the game. And Smartphone Inc., again, like A Study in Emerald, does this by a physical manifestation of, here's your raised, elevated area where here are the phones that you have produced this turn, and separating them from your supply.
Yeah, I think one of the more like staid examples of this for me is kind of like lighter games that are sort of like elevated by their production. Like, this is not a case for me of where a game is like necessarily made by its production, but I think of something like a Splendor, or something like an Azul, or something like a Railroad Inc., where like I do think that they're good, if not light games, but like I think their production elevates them in a huge way, where something about the tactility of like the chips in Splendor or the feel of the tiles in Azul, it gives it a more playful hands-onness to it that makes it all feel a little bit less abstract. If the Splendor chips had been small little chits that you're gathering, there's something that's insubstantial about that. Like, taking a physical piece can have like an emotional weight to it that like makes you feel better about the game, quite simply. Like Railroad Inc., I think, is a good example of this, where like I think roll and writes have just a very specific functional feel to them. It's like a pad of paper, some pens, and maybe some small dice. But what Railroad Inc. does is it says, okay, no, these are whiteboards. We're giving you these markers with erasers on the back of them. We're going to put this whole thing inside this glossy magnetic box and give you these big, chunky, colorful dice. And suddenly you've elevated yourself above the roll and write crowd in a way that just kind of feels like, ooh, this is fancy. This is like special. It kind of makes the game, it feels like an essential part of the experience of the game, if that makes sense.
All right. And this is going to lead us perfectly into a hot question. Neil?
Oh my God.
The return of the hot question.
Given everything that we have just said about board game productions, is it fair to review digital board game implementations?
That's a very interesting question, and I think it's one that is going to vary depending on the person you ask it to, right? Like, I think for me personally, tactility and the aesthetic component of a board game is such a huge part of a board game that I definitely feel that I put a lot of weight sometimes into the way a production helps or hurts a game. And I think that like some of that comes into like questions of user experience, user interface, and how that helps and hurts a design. It's hard for me to separate the two sometimes. And like that makes it really hard when, you know, like something we had to do a lot over the course of last year was evaluate games purely digitally. And I kind of feel like, well, I don't know they got my handle on it. And like, you know, sometimes you're forced to do that. Sometimes we don't have the option but to evaluate a game that we've only played digitally. But it's an interesting question. I think you'd have a lot of people, and I suspect, Mark, you're going to veer very strongly to the opposite end of this, where it's like, no, the mechanics are first and foremost.
It's interesting. I'll just tell you what my stance
Sure.
on this is, and then you can tell me what you think. But it's funny. I think when a game has a very good digital implementation, like say on BGA, where everything's sort of set up, you just make your selections and then everything's working.
The cards go flutter.
Exactly.
They move
like
for you.
Clockwork. That's the sound of clockwork, ladies and gentlemen. I'll call that like one type of game. And then the other type of game is like the tabletop simulator and the stuff where it's just like a physics engine and you have the pieces in front of you and you're moving them digitally, but they're representing like real life pieces. I think games that are in the first category, first of all, they no longer, in a lot of cases, have the real life appeal to me. Like, why would I play Seven Wonders Duel in person when I can play it online and have the cards set out for me easily and have all the calculations done? So they sort of like are no longer board games to me. They're like this digital implementation. And the other games, they are lesser experiences because, you know, you got to figure out how to move this cube and like stacking all this stuff. But they sort of retain their board game-ness. And so when it comes to evaluating the production value of games that have a digital implementation, to me, if they have a digital implementation that is like basically like a video game where everything is done for you, again, it just sort of ceases to become a board game in my mind. It becomes like a video game. But then the other ones, like, I still feel like the mechanics are there and I can evaluate them based on the mechanisms, but the production is obviously hard to tell in a digital implementation, but I'm still looking forward to it. It's like something that I need. It's sort of what makes a board game a board game.
I think that's an interesting take. Like, the closer they get to being video games, the less that you even start to compare them in the context of other board games, because
why would I go back?
Exactly. That is a good point. I do feel like I get a better feel for how a game will play as a physical production on like a tabletop simulator.
Yeah.
I think that my opinion on this has kind of changed a little bit with some recent games like Lost Ruins of Arnak and Nidavellir, where they have fantastic BGA implementations, and now I'm just a little bit suspect of their Board Game Geek rating reviews because so many people are playing them on BGA. You know, I talked about how Nidavellir has kind of annoying scoring and that a lot of the upkeep is done by Board Game Arena, and I actually had someone reach out to me and they said, you know, there's a phone app where you can take a picture of your board state and then it just tells you what your score is. And I was like, what? Now, that for me kind of was a negative. Again, that's not going to ruin the game, and I think Nidavellir is actually really cool, and I've really enjoyed my plays of it on Board Game Arena. But the idea that you even need this phone to take a picture would be a knock against other similar games in the category. For some reason, this reminds me, I've been watching a lot of espresso coffee machine reviews of grinders and stuff for no reason at all, no reason to even talk about this. But there's the output, which is the espresso. How good is this machine at making espresso? And then there's also sort of the feel-ski part of it about like, what does it feel like to touch the machine, and what does it feel like to have the machine on your counter, and how heavy is it, and what is it made out of, and what do the buttons feel like to push, and how long does it take to get to temperature. And so the output in some ways could be the same, but everything that gets you to that output is different or feels different or wrong. And I sometimes wonder if we're conflating some things together when you're not holding a board game production. I think in general, I knew we'd all agree on that concept, but I just thought it might be interesting to sort of suss out together, you know, and publishers will reach out and say, well, we can send you a pre-production copy, or you could play it online right now. And I think 9.5 out of 10, we would prefer to have the physical copy so that we could sit and evaluate it all together.
Right. One thing we sort of touched on that to expand on is like the production issues where the game is produced in an oversized fashion to, I think, sort of like impart a feeling like you're getting a big game here, but I think it sort of hurts the game. A couple games spring to mind that we've recently played. The first is Equinox, as we mentioned before. This is a Knizia game that in the past has been a very small production, and now Equinox has these large tarot cards which do accentuate the art, which is wonderful, but it's like such a table hog and just unwieldy. The other one that we recently played that I think falls into the same trap is Mountain Goats, which is a wonderful game. I really, really enjoyed it. It's a take on Can't Stop, but it's just like a small box, which is great. Again, you got a small box, fantastic. But then, you're putting these huge, oversized cards on the board to represent the numbers that you're on. And it's just really, I feel like, unnecessary for the size of the game. I love the small box, but, you pull these things out and suddenly your whole table is consumed. And it's like, it's not only just about being a table hog, but it's just unwieldy.
Yeah.
It's like, it's just too big.
I remember thinking it struck me as like this could have been like an oink box game,
Yes,
and then
for
you
sure.
can carry it anywhere, and it's this perfect little carry around with you fill or push your luck game. But that's entirely blown away by the size of the production they decided to go with.
Mountain Goats, I think the weird thing with that one is that it actually could all exist on one half sheet of paper. You know what I mean? Like, so that's a deliberate like table presence because the box is small. Like, usually I feel like publishers make the big box, but then the contents are really small.
Yeah.
Which is to say, like the Splendor, like everything fits into like 1/10 of the
Right.
box, or Code Names, which is like 1/3 of the box, where Mountain Goats tries to sprawl out. I have actually become a little less enamored with Oink games and their box sizes. I get it as a creative, artistic constraint, but like none of them fit back in their box once you've done it. Like, I look over at my shelf and I'm just annoyed at the production choice they have made, which is like all of the boxes need to be 50% bigger in order for them to stay flush. And I would prefer that over what we have now.
On a similar note, this is like part of the big problem I had with Red Rising, which is a game that is in a big, a standard sized square, big box, has very lavish production, has this big board, has like, stuff that sprawls across the table, but the game feels very slight compared to all of that table presence. And especially when you're re-implementing a game that is a much smaller card game that comes in a smaller box, and the stuff you're adding doesn't feel like it justifies all of that sprawl and that production size and that box size, that hurts your perception of the game, because you have the big box, you think, okay, big box game, and then everything about the design feels much smaller than what you were promised. I sometimes think that there is a lot that you have to marry just right just to get, again, like the experience to match up with what people are getting from the game mechanically.
Yeah, I think, imagine you're a designer who designed some small little card game, and then the publisher comes up with like a way to make it $65 on Kickstarter, and suddenly it's in a different echelon of expectation. I think that the heavier you get as a board gamer, the more you say it's mechanics all the way for me, man. Like if the game has good mechanics, who cares about everything else? And yet when we get to talking about Equinox, it's like we love these animals fighting to the death in the arena, and like somehow that supersedes the mechanisms, and then we get to the production. And so everything is adding together in a way that it's very hard to rip it apart and evaluate it piecemeal, as we're trying to do right now.
One thing I wanted to call out, which is an example I've cited before about a very good marrying of production choices with design choices. And funnily enough, actually, having just spoken about Red Rising, this is another Stonemaier game. This is Scythe. I think one of the things that Scythe does brilliantly is it creates a more accessible than you'd think user experience by some production choices. Like the player boards have a very clear iconography that very clearly shows the costs of things versus the benefits of things. And then you have components that cover up parts that will be revealed to increase and decrease their costs. The boards are like double thick inset cards so that everything notches into place. So setup is very clear. The way things move from the top to the bottom of the board is very clear. And the way the costs and the benefits increase is very, very clear as you're doing all of that. And then one other small thing, which is I think quite brilliant, which Kellen reminded me of before we started recording, is Scythe has two types of units, basically. You have your plastic units, which are your leaders and your mechs, which are the ones that are responsible for combat, and then your wooden workers are purely responsible for resource gathering. And just like using different materials for both of those is a production choice that like you can clearly say to someone, no, the number of plastic miniatures are the ones that are effective in combat, and the wooden ones that look more like traditional Euro meeples, That's your resource collection. That's a very clever little aesthetic choice that I think can sell some of those concepts to people.
I think, Neelan, that the upgrade board on Scythe is perhaps the greatest and easiest example of this to show anyone, which is to say that you could redo it and have sort of a leveled system where it's like, okay, it starts here, and then if you upgrade it, this gets more expensive, and that produces more. And then you would have a really ugly board that's like level 1, level 2, all across. But instead, you pick up a cube, right, from one place and move it down and put it on top of another space. And boom, now you know that something has gotten cheaper and something has gotten more powerful.
Yeah. And what's so clever about that is just like it encourages people to like interact with it. It's like you're lifting up the cube to see what's underneath it, and then like, oh, okay, I could lift that up to get this, versus just trying to evaluate, like you said, like the opposite approach, which is putting all the information present at all times.
Well, and it's an interconnected mechanism that is made simpler by its production choice. And that is to be just lauded as we can, which is why I chose it in my top 100 draft and why you should vote for me. I did want to touch just one more time on Smartphone Inc. as another example of this, where Mark and I have talked about the specific example, but Smartphone Inc. is just an amazing board game that is way heavier in what you get to think about and do, but everything feels light from a mechanical perspective, and that has a lot to do with many of the production decisions that they've made in the game, where it's very easy to see what phase. There's a lot of phases in the game, but it's very clear at the top you're moving a giant wood disc across as you do the phases. The price of everyone's phones is on one side of the board and very easy to see. There are inlays for all of this stuff that just, again, is a tactile sense of upgrading your infrastructure. I am always shocked by the level of decision-making that can happen in a game of Smartphone Inc. for how quick and easy and breezy it is to play. And I really think that the presentation and the production decisions they've made allow you to get in and start playing that game in a way with very little obstruction. So that is going to do it for our discussion on production in board games. If you've got some examples of games that are made way, way better by their production or way, way worse by their production, we'd love to hear about them. You can reach out to us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, on our Discord at boardgamebarrage.com/Discord, or you could email us at boardgamebarrage@gmail.com. We have a very active Discord community, a pretty active Facebook community, and a Board Game Geek Guild if you want to be an OG and join the guild. We will talk to you wherever you want to talk. Mark especially loves to talk to you,
Chatty,
the
chatty,
loyal
chatty.
listeners. As always, thank you to Heart Society Music for their fantastic song, What's on Your Mind, Kid, from their album Wake the Queens. Thank you guys so much for listening to the show, and good night.
Good night.
Goodbye.
I am a pirate. Literally. Imagine if a pirate was using a mask, a COVID-19 mask, to be a pirate. And that's what I'm wearing right now. I have no shame or dignity, or both. Those two things combined.
Definitely no dignity.
It's very hard to see. Okay. I guess
I don't know why that'd be the
happens
case.
when you cover up 50% of your vision. So